Go for it.
Okay, my name is Elizabeth Ann Ernstine Barton Garnett, and I was born at St. Rose Hospital in Great Bend in November the 15th, 1934. And I grew up south of the river, Arkansas River, in Ellinwood. And I graduated from Ellinwood High School. And I went to college, and I graduated from Kansas State University. And I was married and moved to Kansas City and lived there for about 18 years before we bought some farmland south of Kansas City where I lived. And so what I'd like to talk about is my great-grandfather.
All right. Tell us about your great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather was named Christopher Bach, and he came to Ellinwood by trade in January of 1874, and that was 145 years ago.
Where was he coming from train?
He was coming from Jamestown, Missouri. That's where the family was living at the time.
Okay. Was he originally from Germany, or did he?
I think he was born in Germany and came over with his parents.
Okay, and then they were in Missouri, and then they came over to Kansas.
Yeah. Well, he was looking for land, and he wanted better farm ground than what they had there in the hill country of Missouri. So he bought a claim, a right to 160 acres, 4 miles north of Ellinwood. Then in July, he came back out, and he walked the farm, because in January he couldn't walk a farm. And while he was walking the farm in July in Kansas, you know, you get hot and you get sweaty. And he took his dress shirt off and laid it over some tall grass to kind of dry out before he got ready to get back on the horse and go back to town. And when he picked up his shirt, the grasshoppers had eaten the collar. But well, he went back to town and he made arrangements for a house to be built on the place. And this house was to have a basement so that they could store stuff in their basement like people stored in the cellar, but they wouldn't have to push snow, wouldn't have to open up the area in order to go in and out at night or in the winter. And so then he went back home and made arrangements to come out by covered wagon. And he returned home, and they made their plans. They had everything planned out to what they thought would be just fine. And then they hired a young man that had a team and a wagon and a saddle horse to go along, so they would have 3 wagons in their caravan. And all the plans were made, and the morning that they were to leave, the young man that they had hired, the single man, he showed up with a wife. And this was going to be their wedding trip. My great-grandmother was rather upset because they hadn't planned enough food for an extra person. So they were going to have to make some stops along the way in order to have enough supplies. So they went from Jamestown, Missouri, to Independence, where they restocked again, and then they crossed the Missouri River at Westport Landing, which was near Kansas City at that time. And it took them half a day to cross, to get the wagons across, and they had 35 head of cattle with them that they crossed with, and started on their trip. They had their next rest stop was at Council Grove, which was a common rest stop for people that came west on the Santa Fe Trail. And the rest of the animals, they stocked up some more on groceries. And then they went on to Barton County to the farm, and they got there in November. And it included great-grandpa, great-grandma, and great-great-grandpa. And there were 3 sons a half-brother, or a stepson and a stepdaughter, and the couple that had gotten married and made the trip with them. And they didn't stay very long after they got there, and then they headed back to Missouri.
Who headed back to Missouri?
Hmm?
The couple, the people that brought them?
Who went back to Missouri?
The couple that got married that were on their honeymoon.
Okay.
They went back to Missouri. They just stayed a little while, rested the team and repaired wagon, and then they headed back home. Great-great-grandpa Bach was a tailor, had been a tailor in Germany. And my grandmother remembers him making his own shirts. And he also made this first year they got there in November. And of course you couldn't bring everything you needed, so there were things that you were really lacking. And Betty was always a concern with this many children and this many people. And where they settled was about 2 miles to the east end of the Cheyenne Bottoms. That was before mankind came in and started draining and trying to change everything around. And so the boys would take a horse and go to the Cheyenne Bottoms and were trying to shoot some ducks or geese because it was in the flyaway, the central flyaway. But whenever you'd shoot, everything would fly up, so they couldn't get very many at a time without spending a lot of time there. And boys being boys, they became very inventive, and they found out that, if they tied the horse a little ways away from them, from where the water started, that they could kind of wait in the shallows, and the ducks wouldn't move. They could walk among them. So they took their slingshots, and they killed as many ducks and geese as they thought they could haul back home. They hauled them home. The family all worked. They picked all the down feathers and the small feathers off, and they started making feather ticks. And by the time hard winter came, everybody had a feather tick.
What's a feather tick?
What? Sorry.
Go ahead.
What is a feather tick?
Well, it's a cover that's made and filled out of a heavy fabric. That's why it's called ticking. And a lot of times you'll find ticking on pillowcases that you even buy today. It's made with a heavier fabric. And they stuff it with this down. And this is what you buy when you order a down comforter.
Mm-hmm.
It's filled with this, and it's extremely warm and keeps people very warm, and especially when you live in a house that doesn't have heat upstairs or limited amount downstairs. So this really was a big deal for them to have this. But they had all this meat from the birds. And so great-grandma cooked the breasts, and they had bought some stone crocks, and they put it down into the crocks, and then they poured goose grease over the top, and then covered it either with heavy store brown paper or piece of cloth, and they dug a pit out in the yard and buried it and put some straw over that, and then dirt as like a type of homemade refrigerator, freezer. And then they got jars out throughout the winter or into the spring, so they had a variety of meat. And let's see, my grandmother talked about that they would see antelope flocks, herds, come from the northwest and go southeast. Don't remember ever saying that they ever ate any antelope. She said she knew that she'd eaten buffalo once because a man had killed a buffalo on Cow Creek and sold them some of the meat. But otherwise, they saw buffalo the first year they were there that came to drink and lick salt at the east end of the Cheyenne Bottoms. But after that, they never saw buffalo again, really. But then that was after the trains had gone through in the west, shooting the buffalo, trying to eliminate them from the country. They saw Indians come for several years, and they would come and pick up salt along the edge of the bottoms and the grass and things. Because this is all part of the great salt basin that runs from Cheyenne Bottoms the salt marsh, which is now Quivira, over to Hutchinson, Kansas, where they carry company mine salt. It's all part of the Great Salt Basin. And so they knew where to go and collect salt that they could get by just picking up that they needed for their own use. And my grandmother did not see Great Bend until the late 1870s. And a neighboring family invited her to ride with them, which would have been probably a 12-mile trip. And she thinks that she remembered was that the town was just full of livery barns. Well, everybody had horses and everybody had to stable something. And then several years later when she went another time, they had streetcars that were pulled by mules. I can't imagine streetcars being pulled by mules in Great Bend. But, you know, that's just the difference in progress as time goes along. And the family got along really well. The first year the men drove to Bunker Hill for coal and then to Cow Creek for wood. And the only wood was really cottonwood, which is not a good quality wood at all. And another trip was made to Medicine Lodge to get cedar posts because they needed a good wood to be put in the earth to make fencing. And so when they made that trip to Medicine Lodge, it was really hard on my grandmother and my great-grandmother because the men were gone for 2 months cutting posts, filling the wagons with posts. And so they had to manage the farm. Neighbors came and helped when they could. But she often commented that was an awful long, hard summer for them. And the first winter they bought a beef from a farmer south of the river, which is referring to the Arkansas River. And they got mired down in quicksand on the return trip. So they had a hard time getting it onto land again. The first bridge that was built across the Arkansas River from Ellinwood to the south, which was the only way people that lived south of the river could come into town, was in 1904. No, 1876 they built the Iron Bridge, what they called the Iron Bridge. And then it collapsed, and they built a wooden bridge in 1904. And it collapsed the day that my father graduated from 8th grade. My grandfather had taken him into town in the buckboard for graduation, and on their way back home, the bridge collapsed. They got across, but it collapsed. So then another bridge had to be built. And this time, they built a concrete bridge. And that bridge is now obsolete. And they built another one in 2000 sometime that took a different path around. But it was always a problem for people to get to town. And because my grandparents was the last house before you crossed these old bridges, they were the stopping place and the social gathering place for the people in the communities on south. They would come and the ladies would have their town clothes wrapped up in a sheet, and Grandma would have them come in and they'd use their bedroom and change their clothes and get ready to go into town. And the men would dust themselves off and water the horses. And my grandfather was a very good winemaker, and he always had wine to serve the guests. And then they'd go into town and do their shopping. And when they got through, they came back and they stopped there and they changed their clothes into everyday things and went on home. So it was a real social place to meet. And they had a door on the west side of the house that was used at that time. Now, when I was a little girl growing up, that door wasn't used at all. In fact, in the little vestibule, you came in and then there was a door into the living room and a door into the bedroom. But that area then had a furnace put in, a floor furnace, because there wasn't any road or anything used out in front of the house anymore. And the family always had molasses barrel. And And the first few years, we took our sorghum to Bill Stover near Claflin, Kansas, and had it made into molasses. Later, Father bought it from a little sorghum mill at Sterling. One day at noon, we heard a crash in the basement. A cottonwood beam had rotted through and had fallen right into our sorghum barrel, our molasses barrel. Can you imagine cleaning up a 50-gallon barrel of molasses off the floor? Oh.
Were you there when that happened?
My grandmother was,
Oh, your
yeah.
grandmother.
Yeah, they were at the table and they heard this happen. And my grandmother, which is hard for me to believe, but she did the buying to a large degree. It started at the age of 5.
She did the what?
She did the buying for the family.
Wow.
She would go into town with her father or with somebody that came by in a wagon. She'd thumb a ride into Ellinwood to buy groceries and buy supplies. And because her mother had such terrible varicose veins that she couldn't endure the bouncing on a buckboard or in a buggy or anything. So at a very early age, she became the buyer of the household. She'd have her list and she would go and get the things and bring them back.
Was part of it because she could speak English and they still spoke German?
Well, everybody spoke German in town.
Oh.
Yeah, everybody spoke German yet. And that was part of, but she wouldn't have been to school yet.
Right.
She wouldn't have been to first grade yet. I mean, that just blows my mind that this was her responsibility. And it continued until she got married and left home. That was her main responsibility.
Did they give her money or did they give her things to trade?
They gave her money.
Wow. Did she ever buy something for herself?
Never knew of it. She never said anything. She never got in any trouble or anything. I mean, you know, they had a tight list. Money was tight, always tight. But that was one of her jobs. And if she heard a wagon coming down the road that was headed toward town, she'd grab her list and her stuff and she'd run out to the road and thumb a ride into town with them and come back. Otherwise, she'd go in with her dad if he was making a trip, but they didn't go to town very often. Mm-hmm. So
was she the oldest girl?
She was the only girl until well, she had a baby sister that was born after they moved there, so she was a lot younger. And my grandmother talked about how the things had changed in the country through the years, that from horsepower to electricity and powered farming equipment had changed the way of living from the pioneer days. And when she married Gottlieb Ernestig, and they were married in 1889, the previous year he had purchased a piece of land and the present home site where he added on to the house and built a very comfortable house for the family. And he grew up, he was born in Prairie View, Illinois, from German descent too that had come across. Part of one side of the house had come through Ellis Island, the other had come up through New Orleans. And they kind of met and got acquainted in St. Louis. But when Grandpa Ernstine built a house, he put all cypress woodwork in it. And he was quite a carpenter.
And where did he get the cypress from?
He ordered it, had it shipped on the railroad. And all the outbuildings were made of cypress wood. And they're still standing today because cypress does not rot.
I didn't know that cottonwood wasn't a good wood, but I guess...
Oh no, it isn't even good for firewood. you wouldn't buy it to put in your fireplace to burn. No.
And that's
It's
the
just
only that's the only tree they really had out here at that time.
Yeah, that was the most common tree.
How old were you when your grandmother died?
I can't tell you offhand.
Okay.
She lived to be 95.
Okay, so you knew her for quite a while.
Oh, yeah. And I was always dropped off at her house. She babysat me, so to speak, but, you know, I'd help her do things. She was losing her, she had cataracts and was kind of losing her sight, so I was the one that had to do a lot of the dusting and was sent upstairs to dust the bedrooms upstairs and do all those kind of things. And she'd sit and tell me stories about things that happened in her childhood. And like when they came across with the covered wagons, they had a basket fastened onto the back of the wagon, the last wagon, and they would let her down for a while because you couldn't just let a kid sit on the bench at her front and ride forever. And so she was told, you know, as long as you stay on the track, we won't lose you in the grass. And you watch for chips, cow chips, buffalo chips, or anything. And you find one, you pick it up, and you put it in the basket. So when we stop tonight, we'll have chips to start a fire to cook supper, because there was no wood along the way.
Oh goodness, how old was she when she came out to Kansas?
She was 3.
Okay, goodness gracious.
I can't imagine a little 3-year-old. And she was not a big woman. She was barely 5 feet tall. And I think when she probably was pregnant and almost ready to deliver a child, that she might have tipped the scales at 110. She was very petite.
Mm-hmm. What other, was that the common method of transport when she went? Was people would come in a covered wagon out here? Yeah. Was that the standard thing to do, is to hire someone to bring you in a covered wagon?
Well, they owned the 2 wagons,
Oh.
but they needed 3.
Okay.
So they rented a wagon, rented a man and his team and everything, which was a common thing. It's just like Teamsters were people that were rented to carry goods on the trails from place to place.
What was the name of the trail that she came out on?
Santa Fe.
Okay. Yeah.
The railroad was Santa Fe.
Mm-hmm. Was there a railroad at the time also?
Yeah, that's how my great-grandfather got to Ellinwood, was by railroad.
Oh, and then they just had to take a wagon because they had all their belongings.
Yeah, to bring their belongings, to actually physically move, they had to do it with covered wagon.
Okay. Did she say how long that trip took?
Took over 3 weeks.
That's a long time.
It's a long time. It's a lot of sleeping on the ground. So they had a daughter that lived to be 40, and I have a picture of her in here that this is her college graduation picture from Kansas State. And she graduated in home economics, and her brother went to college at the same time, and he graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. And so she started teaching school, and she'd kind of work her way west. She'd teach in this state, then she'd get a little farther west, and she got a little farther west, and always trying to save money to go on to get her master's degree. And she got her master's degree from Berkeley University in California.
Oh. She got all the way out west.
Yeah, she got all the way out there. And then she was hired to work in a hospital in Boston. And so she went to Boston, and back then they had, I would call it like dormitory rooms, because, you know, they employed so many women, and they needed the nurses right there, they needed the housekeepers there, the dietitians and everything. And so not to be caught out someplace in a rented room where you couldn't get to the hospital, they provided living quarters for a lot of these people. And so she lived in a dormitory with a lot of other women. And some of her roommates noticed that she just wasn't acting right. And they talked to her, and they couldn't figure out what was going on, but they knew something was wrong. And so they packed up her trunk, and they put her on a train in Boston and sent her to Ellinwood, Kansas by train by herself, knowing that she was sick. So when she got to Ellinwood, Grandpa and Grandma didn't know what to do. They talked with the horse and buggy doctor that they had in town, And he suggested that they take her to St. Louis to the Barnes Hospital, which was the most progressive hospital in the area. So they went to St. Louis with her, and they found out that she had a spider brain tumor, and she had breast cancer. And I was born in November 1934. And she was already very sick, but she wrote me a letter. And I have a copy of the letter she wrote me, because she couldn't go to the hospital.
And what's your relationship to this person?
She was my aunt.
Okay.
So she said, "Dear Elizabeth Ann, what a lovely day for your first weekly birthday and anniversary. It just does not seem fair that I have to wait here until you and your mother come home for my first glimpse of you. As Virgil, who was my oldest brother, says, I had it all figured out that I could make the trip to Great Bend and see all of you, your nurses, who are keeping you so dolled up. You certainly made a hit with your Aunt Rose and Naomi. Now be a good little girl and have a big smile ready for me when you come home on Saturday. With love, Aunt Annie." And she lived 2 more months.
Oh.
It's all right. But it's a precious thing to
It is
have.
precious.
A letter sent to the hospital.
Yeah. So did you see her? No.
Well, I would
Very
just.
long.
I would have
Very
been
little
2
baby.
weeks old. I would have been 2 weeks old.
Okay.
Right. So she was. They lost her when she was 40 years old. My grandmother never got over it. She never wanted to buy new shoes or new dress or anything. She said, "I just won't live long enough to wear them out." She was so sure that she would die, right after that. And it was a real hard blow for the family.
Sure was.
That's my father in his army uniform.
Where did he fight?
Huh?
Did he go fight in a war?
He was drafted and sent to Fort Riley with his brother William. And after he finished his basic training, the flu epidemic had hit Fort Riley. And they made him an orderly, and until within 3 months of the time that he was going to be discharged, he took care of the sick people. They had so many people sick on the base, and they didn't have enough places for them. The barracks were, the snow could come in, they didn't have running water in a lot of them. And so the Army rented Nichols Gym on the Kansas State campus, so they would have a building that could be heated and had a laundry facility and bathroom facilities. And so he worked there, taking care of the sick. And then toward the end, they thought maybe he was coming down with the flu. So they transferred him to Fort Hood, Texas, for what we would call R&R today. But it was light duty and rest. And he didn't come down with the flu.
What year which flu epidemic was that?
1918.
Oh.
Killed millions of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Anna.
Uh-huh.
I have Anna's diary, and in her diary she has a picture of a stack of wood that's probably 18 feet tall. And her caption underneath that wood pile is, "Will there always be wood to burn?" Because that's how they fueled everything. They had to heat their homes with wood. They used wood for steam for tractors and stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting that she was thinking ahead, wondering if they would always heat with wood and would there always be enough wood to heat with.
Because they'd seen the effects of deforestation already. Right.
And for her to write you a letter when you were only 2 weeks old,
Right.
that is so special.
Right. sent it to the hospital.
It makes it really real to you.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
I think
And
that's
you
wonderful.
can almost feel how anxious she is. I want to live long enough to see this little girl. And my father was the only child. There was 4 in the family, 3 boys and a girl. And my father's the only one that had children. So who got spoiled? Because I was the only granddaughter on both sides of the house. And my father was a very inventive person. He built farm equipment. He made tractors. He would send to Kansas City and buy wrecked Pierce Arrow trucks and have them set out on the railroad. And then he would convert them into powered farm equipment and things.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And my grandfather, Gottlieb Ernstine, he was an evangelical Reformed church member, and he had gone through catechism in Prairie View, Illinois, and he was very determined that all of us children, his children and us grandchildren, would all become members of the church. So his children had a terrible struggle with catechism because it was taught in German. They could not read German, nor could they write German. And so it was just a real ordeal for them. And I always thought it was interesting that the year I was born was the first time the church ever held an English service in 1934, before they converted to English church services. My mother didn't speak any German, so she never went to church with my father. And my father didn't go too often because he couldn't take the wife.
He couldn't take what? He didn't go. Why? Because he couldn't take.
He didn't take her because she couldn't
Oh,
understand German.
okay.
And she couldn't understand what people around her were saying, and she couldn't understand the service.
So in Ellinwood, they just had one Catholic church, and it was German.
This isn't Catholic.
Oh.
This is Protestant.
Oh, Protestant.
Yeah, the Catholic church was across the street.
Okay.
And then later years when we had automobiles and things, then they alternated the times of services that we had so we could have use of parking on Main Street. And then our services were over, and then the Catholics would have another service and they'd have parking. And that's the way it worked out. That military conscription was passed on May 18th, 1917 by the United States Congress. And on June the 5th, 1917, my father and his brother had to register for the military and were called into service. So that was the beginning of conscription. And that continued until after, the Vietnam War was it, when it became a volunteer army. And who knows, we may have to go back to a conscription service again. And my mother taught school. She lived in Great Bend.
Mm-hmm.
And she taught school in Ellinwood and stayed at a boarding house. And she'd leave a note in the mailbox at the post office telling my father what time she'd be ready for him to pick her up to drive her to Great Bend on Friday to stay with her parents, and he'd go and get her on Sunday evening and bring her back to Ellinwood. And this was the courting car. It was originally yellow, but it was bought by Harrah's Auto Collection in Reno, Nevada, and they restored it. And my brother was out there. He got to sit in it after it was restored.
It's a beautiful car.
Beautiful car. Originally it sold for $4,700.
And explain why she had to quit teaching.
Did she get married?
But,
Why did she stop teaching?
oh, you couldn't teach when you were married.
Yeah, that's lousy.
One of the things I'd like to tell about my mother, as a teacher, she had a little girl, and she taught 4th, 5th grade combination room, and she had a little girl in her room that came from a home where they'd lost their mother, and her father was trying to take care of the 2 older boys and his daughter, and she just only had one dress, that she wore the same dress all week. And so my mother bought material and made this girl 2 dresses. And the lady where she stayed, roomed, let her use the sewing machine. And so she made this child 2 dresses so the girl would be able to change her clothes. Years later, when my mother was in the Woodhaven nursing home at Ellinwood, and she had gone down to the Sunday afternoon gathering where people came and visited and everything, she met this girl's brother, one of the brothers. And they had never forgotten what she had done.
That's beautiful. It's wonderful.
Well, see, I was born in 34. So that following summer, which had been the summer of 35, when the dust started really rolling in again, that my mother had a bucket that she kept by the crib that had cheesecloth in it that she would wet, and she had to change the cheesecloth over my crib every hour or so to protect me from the dust and my lungs. And so I thought it was interesting after I got here and had to see a pulmonologist that she was asking me about the damage in my lower left lung, and had anybody ever said anything about it. I didn't even know what she was talking about. But evidently I had an area that was damaged from the Dust Bowl then.
She said it was common in people her age from the Dust Bowl.